I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman.
Hi, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday afternoon, and we're witnessing what I consider to be the biggest disaster in American political history. And we're going to discuss it with the listeners in terms how did this happen, who should be held accountable, and what's the response in the coming months to what will be the most tumultuous domestic period probably since the Civil War.
That's right, Ralph. Last week, David asked Ralph how he felt about the election, and he replied with one word: nausea. As we record this, it is the day after the election in America 2024, and all the votes have yet to be counted. It appears that Donald Trump, convicted felon, has once again ascended to the presidency of the United States. The Senate has been called for the Republicans, and which party will control the House is still up for grabs, but it doesn't look good for the Democrats. Donald Trump, a Hollywood creation who wears more makeup than the Joker, has once again avoided accountability for crimes he committed the last time he held this position. We can look forward to economic policy shaped by spoiled brat oligarch Elon Musk, health policy shaped by anti-vaxxer RFK Jr., the gutting of government agencies that were put in place to promote health and safety and to protect the environment and workers' rights, according to the dictates of Project 2025. Mass deportations and internment camps for immigrants, unabashed support for the continued ethnic cleansing of Gaza, while dreams of developing beachfront property dance in Jared Kushner's head. A flood of MAGA judges dominating the lower courts while giving Trump the opportunity to appoint younger right-wing judges to solidify control of the Supreme Court for decades to come. A court that has already granted him immunity from any crime he wishes to commit, as long as he does it in his official capacity as president. We can look forward to another 4 years of 30,000 lies and a daily dose of reality TV chaos. The Democrats certainly have their work cut out for them, trying to figure out how to blame it all on Jill Stein. We're going to talk about all of this today with Ralph and Norman Solomon. Norman Solomon is a co-founder of RootsAction.org and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. He has written extensively in several books against the American war machine, while RootsAction is, quote, dedicated to galvanizing people who are committed to economic fairness, equal rights for all, civil liberties, environmental protection, and defunding endless wars, unquote. That fight just got a whole lot harder. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our irrepressible corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, our next guest is going to help us conduct an autopsy of the Democratic Party. David?
Norman Solomon is co-founder of RootsAction.org and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. He's the author of War Made Easy, Made Love, Got War, and his newest book, War Made Invisible, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Norman Solomon.
Thanks a lot.
Welcome back, Norman. I think our listeners expect some explanation that we can make about what happened on November 5th, and plus what needs to be done about it. So let's start with the deterioration of the Democratic Party that made it all possible. They have been showing the American people they're unable to deal and to defeat the worst GOP in history. In election after election, they either lose or they barely win, and they don't have a workable majority at the congressional level and at many state and gubernatorial levels as well. I see the beginning of the end of the Democratic Party as Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew it, with the decision in 1979, led by Congressman Tony Coelho, to start competing for corporate cash contributions, start competing for corporate PACs. This was followed by a decision unannounced that they were going to abandon half the country. It wasn't worth spending money in half the country, which turned into red states. They started out, for example, by abandoning the mountain states and later the prairie states of North and South Dakota, which used to have Democratic senators in the majority in those states. and now are completely dominated by Republicans, where there isn't even any competitive opposition by the Democratic Party. The third is they started contracting out their campaigns to commercial media and political consulting firms who have a lot of business with big business year after year and who controlled the campaigns, the strategy, sometimes the itinerary, the messaging, and became the obstacle to citizen group input, which is critical for the Democratic Party historically, and labor union input. So then they began excluding systematically progressive citizen groups, civic leaders, labor leaders from any kind of input or participation in the strategy of election campaigns. Then they lost in 2010 the gerrymandering contest. They were caught napping, and the Republicans rigged states like Pennsylvania, where you had a majority of Democratic votes in the congressional election, but they had a minority of representatives in the House of Representatives. That's clever gerrymandering, which contest they lost, and that froze the situation for another 10 years. So here we are, the campaign. A lot of people were upset that Kamala Harris was anointed after Joe Biden dropped out, and you were an early advocate of that, and they didn't listen to you either. People wanted a primary so that the people could express their voice for other candidates beyond just Kamala Harris. And then Kamala Harris's messaging was very narrow, was focused very heavily on abortion and defensively on the economy, and not able to focus on what majority of the American people believe is too much corporate control over their lives, 70% or more, or all kinds of popular progressive agendas by Bernie Sanders. She wouldn't appear in public with Bernie Sanders, but she appeared with Liz Cheney and the Cheney gang that led the criminal war of invasion in Iraq that killed over 1 million Iraqis and destroyed that society right up to the present time. So that's the background. And you put out a report on the Democratic Party as part of a progressive group in 2017 titled Autopsy. You made some very clear recommendations after the abysmal failure of Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. And I gather they ignored you. Well, the decline yesterday was spectacular. It wasn't foreseen by the pollsters or anyone else that I know. And listen to this, listeners. In 2020, Biden got 81 million plus votes. In 2024, Kamala Harris got 66 million plus votes. From 81 to 66, Trump got 74 million plus votes in 2020, and he declined to 71 million plus votes in 2024. So the Democrats couldn't even get their base vote out that they got out in 2020. And what are they looking at? Are they looking at themselves in the mirror for introspection? Are they cleaning house? Do they have any plan whatsoever other than collect more and more money from corporate PACs? This is a spectacular decline that I don't know anybody predicted. From 81 million plus Biden votes to 66 million Kamala Harris votes. You don't win an election against Donald Trump with that kind of decline. And now he can boast he not only won the Electoral College vote, but he also won the popular vote. So take it from here. If our listeners ask you, Norman Solomon, how did all this happen? Who is really accountable for the disaster?
None of this is hindsight. And if we go back decades, you and I, many other progressives, have been warning, have been pleading, have been cajoling and fighting against this Democratic Party that, as you note, Ralph, has now virtually no resemblance to the party of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Democratic autopsy was not done by the DNC or anybody at the top of the Democratic Party after the disaster of 2016 that ushered Trump into the White House in the first place. And at RootsAction.org, we realized as the months went by after that terrible debacle in November 2016 that we couldn't depend on the hierarchy, the elites of the Democratic Party to do any sort of autopsy, which had become somewhat traditional after a wipeout negative result in a presidential election. So at RootsAction, we decided to do it ourselves. And so we issued the Democratic autopsy about the 2016 election the year after. And here are a few very brief quotes from this autopsy issued in 2017. And it's really chilling and frankly infuriating to think that you can apply these observations made after the election 8 years ago, and it's as if we're describing what happened yesterday. For instance, the Democratic National Committee and the party's congressional leadership remain bent on prioritizing the chase for elusive Republican voters over the Democratic base, especially people of color, young people, and working class voters overall. That's from our autopsy after 2016. Here's another excerpt. One of the large groups with a voter turnout issue is young people who encounter a toxic combination of a depressed economic reality, GOP efforts at voter suppression, and anemic messaging on the part of Democrats. This is like a flashback and present right now. Here's another quote. Emerging sectors of the electorate are compelling the Democratic Party to come to terms with adamant grassroots rejection of economic injustice, institutionalized racism, gender inequality, environmental destruction, and corporate domination. Siding with the people who constitute the base isn't truly possible when party leaders seem to be afraid of them. And here's one more quote, again from 2017. The Democratic Party's claim to be fighting for working families have been undermined by its refusal to directly challenge corporate power, enabling Trump to masquerade as a champion of the people. Well, that was true in 2016. It's been true this year. And when you've got a bogus, phony, supposedly fighting for working people party, calling itself the Democratic Party, then people are not going to go for it over time. One of the things that we warned about, and Ralph, you mentioned at RootsAction.org, 2 years ago, we launched Don't Run Joe. We could not find one sizable national progressive group to co-sponsor with us, even after Biden filed with the FEC and we needed to change the name to Step Aside Joe. And so we kept being told that party loyalty, uber alles, we had to stay in line with Biden. And as you mentioned a few minutes ago, that lost precious months, even a year and a half, when there could have been a sorting out vigorous primaries. We were told that, oh, it would be terrible to have a inside the party primary system. Well, in 2020, there were 17 candidates. There wasn't space on one stage in one night to hold them all. The debates would have to be in half. Well, it didn't really debilitate the party. Debate is a good thing. But what happened was this party loyalty, this obsequious kissing the presidential feet dynamic allowed Biden to amble along till it became incontrovertible that he wasn't capable. We took out ads. The Don't Run Joe campaign took out ads in the Hill newspaper, print ads. One had a graphic of guys in suits with literally their heads in the sand. And we said, wake up. This is a disaster waiting to happen. This was well over a year ago. One other thing I want to mention is that when the Bernie Sanders forces were riding high after the 2016 election, when it was so clear that the wipeout of the Hillary Clinton campaign existed because what Bernie Sanders was advocating was basically shut down by the Clinton campaign, recognizing the strength of progressive Bernie forces, the Democratic Party established what they called the Unity Reform Commission. And they were careful to make sure that a majority on the commission was pro-Hillary Clinton people from the corporate wing. And I remember attending a couple of those meetings where there was a lot of talk about reform. And I think a very telling aspect was that Jim Zogby, a very progressive member of that committee, been working inside the Democratic Party for decades. He proposed some measures to have some transparency of the financial millions of dollars moving through the Democratic National Committee. And that proposal was shut down and blocked. Why? Because a lot of people on that committee, and of course running the DNC, they and their pals had this pass through of literally millions of dollars of consultant fees win, lose, or draw. It's like General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman. They never lose a war. And so these corporate donors, they never lose a presidential race. They didn't lose what happened with Harris and Trump. They cashed in, they made out like the corporate bandits that they are. So here we're at a meeting of the Unity Reform Commission. And who is the chair of that meeting? Jen O'Malley Dillon. And she makes sure to prevent any passage of the transparency financial reform measures that Jim Zogby is promoting. So O'Malley Dillon pulls it off again for corporate Democrats. Where does she land? Well, when Biden becomes president, she lands at the White House. And then when Biden starts to run for re-election, she's running his campaign. And then when Biden finally bows out and it's Kamala Harris running, Jen O'Malley Dillon runs the campaign of Kamala Harris. So they're not going to step on any corporate toes. And that's really the story that we've been looking at.
Okay, let's go to the strategy of the party, Democratic Party, for the election. They fell into the Trump trap. The Trump trap is they put hundreds of millions of dollars of repetitive ads on how Trump is corrupt, how he's a liar, how he's a bigot, how he is violent, how he's a violator of the laws, how he thinks he knows everything more than anyone else, how he can't process information, how unstable he is. But everybody knew that. They knew that, and they'd already made up their mind. The vast majority of voters decided that this was a reason to vote against him, or, as it turned out, more voters, this was a reason to forget about these traits. We know he's on our side. You know, he has the dog whistles. He knows how to make us feel good about America, etc. So instead of focusing on his 4 years in office, what he tried to do to America and what he did to America, he turned the judiciary into a corporate arm, Federal District Court, Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court. He shut down the federal regulatory agencies for all practical purposes, shoving aside the civil service. He allowed all kinds of corporate crime to go unfettered from Wall Street by, in effect, closing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He then cut corporate taxes for the wealthy, including his family, and for the big corporations in 2017, leading to growing deficits and not putting adequate taxation revenues back into the community to do what he promised to do, which he broke, which is to build infrastructure and public services. And he broke all kinds of other promises. And then it's what he wanted to do, what he wanted to overturn that he didn't quite get away with. Well, all that wasn't part of the Democratic strategy. They didn't really emphasize that. They had throwaway lines. And then the biggest one, which they should have made a big deal of, was he mocked and delayed the onrushing deadly pandemic of COVID-19, delaying days, then weeks, and the health officials attributed the death of 300,000 Americans that could have been prevented if he swung into action when he was first told about it in early January. And they didn't hold him accountable for that as well. So here we are. We are in a situation now where the gang that he's going to bring in, it's not just Trump. Trump's a figurehead. He's a loudmouth. He's the bullhorn. He's the focus of the media, which he manipulates to great expertise by denouncing it. Who now is going to make this analysis? Is it going to be the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which was shoved aside, including Bernie Sanders? Or is it going to be a grassroots effort focusing on the Congress for 2026? In fact, Congress, the only lever people have now, and it's likely to be controlled by the Republicans. The only lever that people have under the Constitution, the way the system operates. And, you know, it's a lever that could be overcome with a major resurgence. But here's the danger. The Trumpsters coming in are fascists. They're police state people. They are intent on revenge. They're intent on ignoring the law, whether it's judicial decisions or regulatory or the Constitution. And so if you have widespread protests and resistance, you're falling into the hands of a police state, which will label them as terrorists, provoke them into a few window-breaking situations, and then turn the public against them. Law and order. It's the Goebbels blueprint here. And then in foreign relations, You think Trump's going to really do anything about the empire? I mean, he's the emperor to begin with. Look at him in the Middle East. If anything, he's worse than Biden. He wants Netanyahu to annex the West Bank and maybe southern Lebanon to the Litani River. He's not going to say no to Netanyahu. He's frightened of the pro-Israeli government can do no wrong lobby in the U.S. And on Ukraine, well, that depends. That's up in the air. But on military budget, he's going to drown the taxpayers with even more. It's already over 54% of the operating budget of the federal government. A huge amount of waste, huge amount of corporate contract crime, huge amount of redundancy, and not balanced by Department of Peace or by any nuclear arms or other negotiations to control the proliferation of deadly weapons that can become an omnicide if unleashed. So here's the danger, Norman. If the resistance is at the street level, it's going to play into the hands of the police power maniacs that are surrounding Trump. And the resistors are not going to get that much of a break in the courts because more than ever before in American history, the courts have pronounced that the executive branch can do whatever it wants, which is exactly what Trump said in July 2019. With Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president. And so he's now citing the Supreme Court decision of last June, which in effect says, with a vague standard, any official act is not a criminal act by the President of the United States. This is the most dangerous period in American history, except for the Civil War. So what do you think the resistance should be like, both inside the Democratic Party and in the civic community and in the labor union community around the country?
So many layers, the civic area, the, as you say, labor, electoral, and at communities across the country. It just has to be multifaceted and definitely nonviolent militancy of the type that Martin Luther King talked about. And an electoral component really has to be, if not central, at least very strategically wielded. People in Congress, and most of them are depraved ideologues of the far right coming in, they still need to worry about getting reelected, as is true for Democrats in Congress. And one reality as an activist that I've come to the conclusion on in the last couple of decades is that progressives tend to be way too nice to Democrats in Congress, especially those that they consider to be allies, because they like what some of the Democrats do, whether they're their own senators or representative or others. And so they give too many benefits to the doubts. It's like grading them on a curve. We can't afford to grade them on a curve. And if any Democrats in Congress say anything about reaching across the aisle, that needs to be denounced and challenged right away. We have this opportunity, and it is a thin window for us, so to speak, but it is absolutely necessary to insist as constituents, as activists, that members of Congress, Democrats in Congress, yield nothing rhetorically in terms of their votes. A compromise should be a poisonous, dirty word with the fascistic politics being pushed by now the controlling forces of the executive and legislative branch. And I think that will require a reorientation of relationships between people who are progressive activists, you might say, quote unquote, ordinary people, and those in office. We need to be activists. We need to be willing to challenge people, and that includes Republicans, to expose what they're doing. It's hidden in plain sight that every area of this country has offices of their representatives. And I think that the right wing has been much more cognizant of this over the decades actively. We can get at these people. They have their offices in our community. They have district offices and so forth. We should be out there demanding meetings and expose the votes. We should be monitoring the votes really closely. One thing which I also think is relevant to what you're raising, Ralph, is that 10, 12 years ago, when progressives would begin to raise these issues more forcefully, beginning to challenge the Obama presidency as it caved into the militarists, into Wall Street, the banks, and so forth, we were told, oh, you're sounding like the Tea Party. And the response should be, look at what the Tea Party achieved. The Tea Party was willing to do vigorous, emphatic primary challenges to Republicans and move the party in their direction. And it goes to the point that we're going to need to take the electoral map and terrain much more seriously. I think there is also cultural, psychological, and emotional set of layers too, is we're going to need solidarity to be much more deep and wide than we have understood it or practiced it in the past. It's interpersonal, it's family, friends, coworkers, fellow students, people in retiree homes, across family generations. We need to recognize that this is, as you were saying, Ralph, an unprecedented situation. Certainly in any of our lifetimes, the by far most extreme right-wing fascistic government. And in contrast to, say, when Nixon was president, there is no counterpoint. There is no, as the saying goes, guardrail. We forget perhaps that Nixon had Democratic majorities to deal with in Congress. So this is a whole new situation.
Apropos your earlier point, it starts with the Democratic Party. They got to clean house. They're not going to clean house. They don't look in the mirror. That's number one. The apparatus is locked in with this industry of the political and media consulting firms that go back and forth from the Democratic apparatus here, and they start new companies. It's a mutual back-scratching, profiteering operation as the Democrats raise more money than the Republicans, much of it from corporate sources. The second is that the labor unions and the progressive citizen groups have fallen down on the job.
Yeah.
They're not pushing the Democratic Party. They're allowing the Democratic Party in all its moribund status to lead them. So you don't see groups like Public Citizen, Common Cause, People for the American Way going after the Democratic Party. In the 60s and 70s, we pushed the Democrats. We exposed the Democrats when they betrayed us. We were independent and arm's length. The same with the labor unions. We tried to work with them on a great Labor Day effort this year to turn Labor Day into a workers' compact for America and to have hundreds of local media events with civic groups at the local level and make the candidates come and adhere to this compact for American labor. And the labor unions that we contacted were gung-ho, all the way up to Liz Shuler, the AFL-CIO. This was in July. And unbeknownst to us, they passed the Democratic Party, and the Party squelched it. Could have led to huge momentum in the following 8 weeks. They squelched it because they basically said to the labor unions, we can't control what's going to go on with all these events, so drop it.
Yeah.
And so they dropped it. So let's look in the mirror here as the fountainhead of our democracy.
Yeah, I think that it's very difficult, of course, at this historical moment, which is our real time, to see any silver linings. I'll try to just pull out a few small but potentially significant ones. The Democratic National Committee has an election for chair coming up. And we can remember that there was a tipping point when Keith Ellison ran and almost was elected chair of the DNC. What's happened, of course, when a Democrat is president, then the chair of the DNC is basically a flunky for the president. And that's been the case for Jamie Harrison, just terrible double talk, serving of corporate interests and so forth. So I think that battle needs to be fought.
Yeah, well, that's the start. They got to clean house and get new, more vigorous leadership. Ellison would certainly be, he's Attorney General of Minnesota now. He would certainly, former congressman, he would certainly be an improvement over the current crop that thinks they know everything and never return calls and engage the civic community. There's another way to look at it, Norman Solomon, and that is the Democratic Party is too corrupt to reform itself. It has brought the country to a spectacular disaster scene that's going to unfold. You're going to see thousands of civil servants quitting before January 20 because they know what's coming. You're going to see regulatory heads leaving because they know what's coming. I don't know what's going to happen to Lena Khan of the Federal Trade Commission or her counterpart in the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. But let's say it's not going to be very supportive if Trump doesn't try to get rid of them altogether. You're going to see a worse judiciary coming up because he'll control the confirmation process. The Secretary of Interior, a Native American, out. You're going to see a lot of people like that out. If you ask me, I don't think the Democratic Party can reform itself. I don't think the civic community has got the energy without new infusion from all over the country, without setting up tough watchdog groups in every congressional district, We put out this newspaper to try to help them and empower them called the Capitol Citizen, try to make them into Capitol citizens and use the only lever we have left, which is the congressional lever. I look forward to some leadership maybe where you get people from the progressive community inside politics to displace the existing moribund, concessionary, surrendering, co-optive group that now runs the Democratic Party and replace it with a new party. But I don't see that happening. And I don't see a third party coming in the traditional sense. So I don't see the displacement of the Democratic Party's present rot. I don't see a third party because we have a two-party oligopoly that presents incredible barriers against third-party candidates. And I don't see anybody with any kind of response yet. We'll see. We'll see. Will the progressive leaders get together around the big table in the next few days? Are they going to demand that the Senate Democrats hold rigorous hearings in November, December until January 20, foreshadowing what the Trumpsters have in mind for our country and our government? Are they going to do that? There's nobody who can stop them. Well, we tried to get them to do that in 2022, and they didn't do it. They frittered away those months on vacations and recess and junket. What's your response? Well, you think they should hold hearings in the next 3 months?
It's a great idea to demand immediate hearings be scheduled by the Senate in the next couple months while Democrats still are in control, literally in control. Psychologically is a whole other question. I think it's a really bad choice to try to reinvigorate the Democratic Party. And I think all the other choices are worse. And so we're stuck with it. That is the reality. We need to fight for state power. I used to say 2-3 decades ago, I echoed the saying, it doesn't matter so much who's in the White House as who's sitting in demonstrations. I think that was wrong. State power is so important. The executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial that flows from both of those, we need to fight like hell for all of that. And the reality is that when you have this huge structure of the Democratic Party, in many ways it's an empty shell that's been taken over by the multi-billion-dollar aggregate forces of Wall Street and the banks and so forth. And you know this, Ralph, really well. I as well. You try to go to the Democratic National Committee building. It's like a fortress. You can't get in. There's not even any phone number to talk to any human being there. And yet they have an Achilles heel, and that is the grassroots. Ultimately, it is the voters. It is civic action that can make a difference. I think of the example of what happened with Barry Goldwater in 1964. That was a wipeout. But the right-wingers of the day, they didn't just slink off and say, oh, we lost, the conscience of the conservative didn't pan out. I guess we'll have to think about a third party. We'll have to think of something else. No, they took 1964 as a kick in the butt, and they organized. And 4 years later, Richard Nixon was elected president.
Yeah, that's a good historical analogy, actually. But where's the energy coming from? The young generation is hanging on to their iPhone. They're into the internet gulag. They don't seem to even know the level of oppression by corporations. They click on, they sign on the dotted line, they go ahead. They're overwhelmed with entertainment opportunities 24/7. Where is the militancy coming from the younger generation the way it came in the civil rights movement and the environmental movement? I don't know whether you can do this with the existing generation. They're either tired, worn out, discouraged. Where's the infusion of the people under 35?
It'll be a tremendous challenge. And of course, the election results will be discouraging to many, understandably. But on the other hand, the eruption of the campuses last spring over the slaughter, the genocide in Gaza, is an example of what can be done, and the cross-generation, the pollination that we can share with each other. Us older people, I'm in my 70s, and younger people, we have a lot to teach each other about communication, about the wisdom from our different vantage points. I'm glad to say that we're just announcing from RootsAction.org the launch of the Teach-In Network. We're aiming for hundreds and hundreds of teach-ins around the country, on campuses and off campuses. We have several dozen great speakers who are already on our website, teachinnetwork.org, and we're intent on having education not just be something to think about, but to activate with. We say knowledge is power, and we need both. Movements need knowledge, and we need power. just having one or the other is not enough. So I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. This is a horrific electoral result. We're going to be up against the wall in many ways. And this is a fascistic regime coming in. We're going to need to take inspiration from those who have resisted terrible repression in many countries around the world. And most of all, getting back to Joe Hill, whether or not we mourn, we've got to organize.
Well, listen to this. The stock market went crazy the day after the election, November 5th. I think the Dow at 2 o'clock on Wednesday was up 1,400, and the NASDAQ was up over 400. So the Wall Street has registered their pleasure with what happened on November 5th. You know, Trump is not just a fascist. He's a corporate fascist. He's a corporate statist. He knows what he's doing. He knows very little about a lot of things, but there are two things he knows about more than the rest of us. He knows more about how to manipulate the media, and he knows more about how he can escape the law. So, having said that, number one, there needs to be a high-level meeting of progressive leaders at the state, local, and national level immediately, especially in Washington. They need to reinvent themselves. They need to stop dilly-dallying and having an attitude every day of least worst. You know how bad the GOP is? We got to support the Democratic Party as they pull everybody down and down and down. The second, the Democrats have to hold hearings in the Senate, and they just can't be asked. They have to have demonstrations in front of the Senate. They have to have pressure from back home, as you say, in their local offices back home, especially on people like Schumer in New York and Durbin in Illinois. And those hearings, and they will get a lot of publicity because the mass media, the corporate media knows that Trump's going to go after them too. Even though they've been like a valet for them, they fear him because Trump is a fascist. And you have to control the media if you're a fascist. But they will give publicity to these hearings, and then that will empower people all over the country to have an agenda, to have a critique forewarned in order to forestall. Can you get on that approach, Norman Solomon, with your groups?
I think it's a great idea. You know, I'll take it to the team at RootsAction.org. I think that using this opportunity the next few months while the Senate is still in relatively sane hands is really important. As you said, there is a cunning demagogue who is getting ready to move back into the White House. And recognition of the reality, not only of who and what he is, but also that this is a fascistic politics grabbing control of the executive and legislative branch, that should not immobilize us. That should motivate us. We've got to get into a much higher gear, and organizing and mass communications through the vehicles we have and can create. I think that's going to be essential.
And also the labor unions have got to start rethinking their role, starting with the AFL-CIO on 16th Street. They have to have demonstrations of workers saying, start representing us now. You're too comfortable. You're too willing to concede to the Democratic Party decisions that you should make on behalf of the rank and file. Now, Trump, I heard that one thing for Trumpster. They said, you know, at least he's against endless wars. Really? He's against endless wars? Wait till you see what he mobilizes against China. He would like to destroy Iran. He's made very violent statements of Iran, and he's got his ally more than willing to follow, Netanyahu, who he's very close to. So we'll see what he does with opposing endless wars. He's going to be surrounded by military-industrial complex. You should see the stock prices of Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics and Raytheon after the election results showed that he was going to win. So we have to start from scratch, listeners. But remember, we outnumber them. There's far more people in this country who want a different kind of country for their children and future. You have any comments on that before we go to Steve and David and Hannah?
We have a mass culture from the corporate media and from the politics coming out of Pennsylvania Avenue that being civically engaged basically means voting once in a while. And that's certainly necessary, but way insufficient. So we have to re-galvanize and repollinate our own culture, progressive culture, you know, at many different levels, including interpersonal, organizational, and ultimately, this is a moral politics. And I think this is something that is really avoided by the Democratic Party structure. They think it's all about throwing money onto the ads and doing polling and so forth. But people are motivated, maybe improperly in the case of Republicans, by what they think are moral positions. And that's why so many young people and others could not bring themselves to vote for Harris because of her unwillingness to break from the Biden policy of supporting and arming the slaughter of so many tens of thousands, perhaps now into the hundreds of thousands of more Palestinian people in Gaza. Moral politics are part of the core of what can motivate people. And to expose it to light, we need to strip away all the artifice and the propaganda.
Well, in the early years of Obama, the Tea Party was formed right from the grassroots. They never were more than 300,000 activists, according to the Washington Post, and they pulled the Republican Party in their direction and began to control the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. They actually got rid of 2 House speakers, Republican speakers. They were tough. They didn't just sit around waiting for the Republican establishment to lead them. So that's a good analogy, listeners. It didn't take all that much, but it took a real level of determination. And of course, we have a great progressive agenda here that is majoritarian supported. 85% of the American people support increasing taxing on the wealthy and the multinational corporations. Over 80% want to break up the big banks. A huge majority wants a living wage. A significant majority would like universal health care. People want a different kind of government. They want a government where their tax dollars come back to them in the community in the form of public services, needed public infrastructure that's crumbling all over the country. Schools and bridges, highways, mass transit, all kinds of clinics that need to be built or expanded, all kinds of local economies that need to be supported to displace the multinational corporate absentee ownership of these communities. So we have a lot of this. All of it's documented, a lot of books on corporate crime, a lot of books on what the future should be like, a lot of books on how to mitigate and prevent climate catastrophe, pushing for renewable energy, which is spreading regardless of Trump. He doesn't like wind power, but the wind is going to prevail because it's so cheap. Look at Texas, heavy with wind power, for example. So I'm trying to convey some level of encouragement here, some level of historical antecedent so that we get going. The blows that are coming after January 20 have to be foreseen in order to be forestalled. Otherwise, they will paralyze the public. They will stun the public. They will disillusion, discourage the public. They will produce lassitude, surrender, enemy, whatever you want to call it. And that's why the public hearings of all these Senate committees with their staff, all hands on deck, and they've got to go into all these areas where they expose what the Trumpsters are going to do, and they propose what should be done, and they get witnesses from all over the country to include the local leadership, not just the people in Washington, D.C., and they publish these materials and they put them on social media. They got a lot of work to do, but I think they're looking forward to a 3-month vacation, and we got to stop them.
We're going to take a short break right now and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Then we'll come back with more of our postmortem with Norman Solomon. Russell, take it away.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 8, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Florida wanted to make it easier to invest in the state's booming economy, but for several weeks, the government accidentally made it illegal for most banks to sell investments there. That's according to a report in the Wall Street Journal. Banks for 4 weeks weren't allowed to sell securities such as corporate bonds or shares of private companies in the state because of a law that went into effect October 1. The law appeared to ban any bank that had been punished by the Securities and Exchange Commission or other authorities from selling a range of securities. The problem is that nearly all of the country's big banks, from J.P. Morgan Chase to Goldman Sachs, have been in trouble with the law at some point. Then last week, Florida's top financial regulator invoked emergency powers tied to recent devastating hurricanes and suspended the part of the law that banned banks from selling securities. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph, as we continue our Democratic autopsy.
Well, there's something, Norman, that we can predict with some certainty. They're coming in like gangbusters into Washington, the Trumpsters. They're greedy. They want concentrated power. They want to crush the will of the people, subordinate it to the corporate state, which means they are going to be very vulnerable to corruption, serious corruption. They can't stop themselves, the greed. And that's where the opposition can come in. That's where the press can come in. That's where you got to litigate and come in. Some of them will have to be fired by their superiors. There was a cabinet secretary that was let go by Trump because of his corruption. So look out for the corruption. And it will be back at the local area, too, in terms of government contracts. Musk is leading his huge constituency into a pit of corruption. He expects to have a powerful position, straddling the corporate sector with the government sector under Trump, and he can't control himself. So corruption can bring down a regime. And remember, it's going to occur at the grassroots, not just Washington, because money knows no boundaries and the exchange of favors and all the rest of it. David?
If the Republicans get control or keep control of the House, what check is there in Washington, in our government?
There's not much apparent at all, not to be rhetorical, but it's going to require the power of the people from the grassroots. Obviously, of course, but sometimes hidden in plain sight, labor unions need to step up, as well as unorganized workers, students, people of all sorts of demographic and categorical descriptions. We've got to, if not activate a sort of a syndicalist approach, at least say that when certain boundaries are crossed, it's intolerable. Exactly what forms that will take in terms of resistance is unclear, but I think it's essential that organizing make it possible to really push back, because if the branches of government are all controlled by basically fascists, we've got to organize with the strength that we have.
And we got to bring back the corporate power, corporate control, corporate coercion, corporate corruption, corporate domination, strategic planning about everything in our society, including breaking up the family with the internet gulag and seducing these young kids 5 to 7 hours a day to junk food, junk drink, violent programming, and all the other nastiness. This could bring together a left-right coalition, Norman, on a lot of these issues. And the other thing is, project around the world. Think of all the democratic forces around the world that are experiencing anxiety, dread, and fear at the result of this election. How in Brazil and Eastern Europe and elsewhere, Europe, right-wing forces, which are surging, are going to feel that they've really got the biggest backing now of the United States of America. And that's something that we have to pay attention to. This is the problem with the Democratic Party. This is the corruption of the Democratic Party. So we got to think anew, as Abraham Lincoln once said, think anew. And remember from your history listeners, when Benjamin Franklin came out of that Constitution drafting in 1787, that hot summer in Philadelphia, and he came out and a distinguished resident of Philadelphia approached him. She said, "Doctor, what have you brought us, a monarchy or a republic?" And he replied, "Madam, a republic, if we can keep it." Well, we have just lost it. Whatever shriveled republic we had left before November 5th, we now have a monarchy with fascist corporate state determination. Wake up, America. Hannah?
I wanted to push back about your comments about the younger generation not being engaged enough. I'll ask about the leadership in the Democratic Party and a lot of even more progressive elements of the progressive movement seems pretty ossified. It seems like the older generation, boomers, and the adjacent generations are clinging to power, saying to the younger generation of activists, organizers, politicians, take leadership from my cold, dead hands. And the right seems to have embraced the dialectic. They have the fringes on the right who push the party and they cope with that and they move a little bit farther right to embrace their voting base. Why isn't the Democratic Party or the progressive movement in general letting those conversations happen and actually change the organs of the movement?
I'd say that age is a factor, but it doesn't necessarily solve a lot. I mean, after all, it's as though we have an aged Politburo with Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and James Clyburn. And the Republican Party has shown it's quite possible to bring people up who are in their 30s and 40s. Need I say the name J.D. Vance? And so, it is a factor, but I would take your point that cold dead hands are gripped around power when it should be loosened. What's happened in college campuses, as I was mentioning, is very important because that's incubating a whole level and layer of leadership that is now in college, leaving college, and so forth. And those are, sorry for the cliche, potential leaders of the future. One anecdote, which I think about a lot, really troubles me. Soon after Biden came into office, at RootsAction.org, we organized a petition, and it was actually an open letter to Biden because he had made all sorts of hostile statements. And this was way before the invasion of Ukraine, hostile statements towards Vladimir Putin gratuitously. And so they were even to the point that he was some kind of devil figure or something. So we organized a petition that said, this is no way to conduct diplomacy. There's nuclear war at stake. President Biden, please stop doing this. And I spoke to the leader of one very well-heeled arms control organization based in Washington. And the leader said, well, we can't sign it because somebody on our board of directors is already being brought into the Biden administration, and we're hoping for a second one. To me, that's symptomatic. And whether it's Republican or Democrat in the White House, no progressive organization worth its salt should be sucking up to the president and the administration. We've got to be independent. We've got to fight for what we believe in.
Remember, you know his targets are going to be. His targets and his Trumpsters like Steve Bannon. His targets, number one, the universities, two, the public schools, three, the immigrants. He's going to be targeting anybody who resists them. He's going to target anybody in the media who challenges them. Those are his targets, in addition to the military people who denounced him over the last few weeks who were inside the first Trump administration. Now, he's going to overplay his hand, but he's overplayed his hand before and got away with it. The question is whether there's anything left of the judicial indictments and the cases that can give him some pause, or are they pretty much done? He'll tell the Justice Department after he becomes president to dismiss the cases. And the Georgia state case, which he's afraid of, is mired down with a very pro-Trump Georgia judiciary. So we're waiting for November 26th to see what the state judge in New York will do. On all this, listeners, listen from history, know about rebounds, develop your own circle in your living room, start your own Congress watchdog groups. You'll see that you'll have a lot of conservative and liberal workers and neighbors who are pretty frightened at what Trump is planning for their children and future generations. And just to complete, I think Trump has refused to release his medical records and history in 2016, 2020, 2024. After he tells the press he's going to be about ready to release it, and he lies. And I think he's not releasing it because of serious material that's disadvantaged to his mental and physical health. So November 5th, the people may have elected Trump. They may have also elected President Vance. Any last-minute comments? Norman Solomon.
Well, the history of this country is people succumbing to tyranny and also overcoming tyranny. And I think we have those forks in the road ahead. Small examples writ large, because what millions of people do or don't do really will make a difference. I think about one of the less well-known statements by Martin Luther King Jr. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but pretty close. Dr. King said, "Power without love is abusive and oppressive. Love without power is anemic." And we need love in action that is coupled with power. Just one and the other won't do it.
Thank you very much, Norman Solomon. Give our listeners the website for RootsAction so they can find out more about what you're doing, especially what you're going to do in the next 3 months.
We'd love for people to sign up for action alerts. You can find a sign up blank at the top of our webpage, which is rootsaction.org.
And remember, listeners, pour it on the Democratic senators in the Senate. They've got to hold public hearings. They've got to bring people from the grassroots to testify. They can go back more empowered. They've got to alert the media about what's coming after January 20, and they cannot deal with these weeks as if it's their vacation. Put the pressure on them, on their local offices and on their congressional offices. 202-224-3121. That's the switchboard, 202-224-3121. Thank you very much, Norman.
Thanks a lot, Ralph.
I want to thank our guest again, Norman Solomon. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of The Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. In about a week, the next issue of Capitol Citizen will be out. Go to capitolcitizen.com. You can get the back issues at $5 donation or more for each issue, and get ready for the next issue. It's a newspaper designed to empower you to become a Capitol citizen and start bringing the power of the people to the 535 men and women who make up our sovereign, we the people, authority under the Constitution, and are not handling it collectively in the proper manner, to put it mildly. CapitolCitizen.com.
Stand up, step up, you ought to stand